Imagine walking through the marble-paved forum of ancient Rome in the year 67 AD. The sun glints off polished columns, incense wafts through the air, and the city hums with the energy of a thriving empire. Suddenly the crowd parts. Emperor Nero appears draped in imperial finery, his arm interlocked with a stunning young woman. Her gown sparkles with silks from the east, her face framed by cascading curls and expensive jewels. Onlookers bow, some whisper. Because behind the illusion lies a horrifying truth. This woman celebrated as Nero's new bride was once a boy named Sporus. This is no ordinary imperial romance. It is the beginning of one of the most disturbing acts of psychological and physical domination ever recorded in Roman history. And you are not a passive observer, you're asked to witness it, as if it's unfolding before your eyes. The storyteller doesn't just report events, he reconstructs them with the intimacy of a guided memory, placing the viewer amid the splendor and rot of imperial power. In this single moment, Rome's grandeur becomes inseparable from its cruelty. It's not just a tale of opulence, but of how absolute power, when unchecked, twists grief into obsession and human lives into expendable artifacts. That haunting image of Nero and Sporus walking side by side encapsulates everything: the pageantry of empire, the silence of witnesses, and the fate of a young boy absorbed into someone else's delusion. This is a story that refuses to remain buried under the weight of centuries. It demands to be seen not for its spectacle, but for the broken humanity it exposes right there beneath the golden robes and the burning Roman sun. Nero did not begin as a monster. When he ascended to the throne at just 16 years old in 54 AD, many Romans believed they were entering a golden era. The young emperor slashed taxes, sponsored games and festivals for the public, and even appeared on stage himself, playing the lyre, reciting poetry, and performing with theatrical flair that delighted the masses. In the early years, he was hailed as charismatic, generous, and even visionary. But beneath the surface, the conditions for collapse were already in motion. Rome was an empire of 60 million people, but Nero stood utterly alone. As emperor, he was not just a ruler, he was a god in the eyes of his subjects. No one could correct him. No one dared challenge his judgment. That isolation, subtle at first, began to erode his sense of self. Surrounded by flatterers and opportunists, Nero's world turned into an echo chamber of adoration, where truth dissolved beneath layers of praise. As the years passed, the weight of absolute power began to press inward. Nero grew increasingly paranoid, convinced that every senator, every general, every whisper in the marble corridors of the palace might conceal a betrayal. He began executing rivals, silencing critics, and retreating deeper into a carefully curated fantasy in which he was not merely emperor, but an immortal artist, untouchable and adored. In this environment, boundaries between art, grief, and cruelty began to blur. What began as idealism slowly collapsed into self-obsession. Power had freed Nero from constraint, but it also freed him from empathy, from accountability, and from the ability to see others as real. The stage was now set. The boy emperor who once brought joy to Rome was vanishing, and something darker had begun to take his place. Amid Nero's slow descent into delusion, one figure emerged who seemed to anchor him to the real world: Poppaea Sabina. To the Roman elite, she was stunning, her beauty, the subject of whispered admiration, her intellect sharp enough to sway policy, and her ambition rivaling that of any senator. To Nero, she became something more, an obsession that would grow into a dangerous infatuation. When he met Poppaea, Nero was still married to Octavia, the dignified but emotionally distant daughter of Emperor Claudius. Their marriage, like many in imperial Rome, was a political arrangement, cold, calculated, and entirely void of intimacy. Poppaea was everything Octavia was not: vivacious, magnetic, seductive. Where Octavia remained quietly dutiful, Poppaea demanded attention. Her presence electrified the court. Their affair began as scandal, but rapidly transformed into something else entirely. Nero didn't merely love Poppaea, he became consumed by her. Ancient historians described his possessiveness with growing alarm. At public gatherings, he placed guards around her, not to protect her, but to monitor her every glance. He gifted her silks from China, emeralds from Egypt, and perfumes imported from Arabia, draining the imperial treasury to satisfy her every whim. Yet, these were not gifts of affection. They were symbols of ownership. Nero didn't see Poppaea as a partner. He saw her as a living ideal, a flawless sculpture animated for his pleasure. Her image was immortalized in statues and portraits, commissioned for both public display and his private chambers, ensuring her presence never left his sight. Eventually, Nero took the ultimate step. He divorced Octavia, an act that shocked even his most loyal supporters. Soon after, he married Poppaea in a lavish imperial wedding that spared no expense. Rome celebrated, but those close to the throne saw the truth. This was not a love story. It was a coronation of obsession. As Poppaea rose to become empress, she stepped into a world gilded in gold, but haunted by control. And though she played the role of Nero's muse with grace, she would come to learn that being loved by a god emperor came with a terrible cost. At first, Poppaea seemed to thrive under Nero's obsessive gaze. She understood his moods, manipulated his affections with care, and used her influence to advance her family's fortunes. But what gave her power also made her vulnerable. Nero's devotion was not rooted in trust, it was rooted in control. And in a court where no one dared speak freely, Poppaea's refusal to silence herself made her dangerous. Unlike Nero's courtiers, who mastered the art of submission, Poppaea retained her sharp tongue. She challenged his decisions, questioned his priorities, and even mocked his theatrical performances when they fell short. In an environment built on flattery, her honesty was rare and increasingly intolerable. The breaking point came in 65 AD, during what some sources describe as a petty domestic dispute. Whether the fight was about Nero returning late from chariot races or his neglect of imperial duties, one detail remains tragically consistent. Poppaea was pregnant. She was carrying what would have been their second child. Stress and fatigue may have sharpened her words. Perhaps she finally spoke too plainly. Nero, already fraying at the seams, snapped. Ancient historians disagree on specifics. Some say he kicked her. Others claim it was a brutal beating. But the outcome was clear. Poppaea suffered fatal internal injuries, collapsing on the marble floor of their palace quarters. Nero, in a moment of horror and confusion, realized he had destroyed the very person he had tried so hard to possess. The aftermath was a grotesque spectacle of imperial grief. Nero reportedly threw himself upon her body, begging forgiveness one moment, issuing commands the next, as if his authority could reverse death. He summoned Rome's finest physicians, threatening them with torture if they failed to save her. But it was too late. Within hours, Poppaea and her unborn child were gone. This wasn't simply a domestic tragedy. It was the implosion of a delusion. Nero had confused love with control, and now that illusion lay shattered at his feet. And in the days that followed, grief would twist into madness, setting in motion a new chapter even more disturbing than the one that had just ended. The death of Poppaea shattered Nero, but not in the way grief typically unravels a man. It did not bring clarity, remorse, or withdrawal. Instead, Nero's mourning turned theatrical, obsessive, and terrifyingly delusional. He refused to accept the finality of her death, not in body nor in spirit. Roman custom dictated that the bodies of the dead be cremated, but Nero would not allow it. Instead, he had Poppaea's corpse embalmed, laid to rest in a lavish mausoleum, more elaborate than any previous empress, her body preserved, like a saint untouched by flame. This was not a funeral, it was a coronation of death. He declared her divine, establishing a state cult in her name. Temples were dedicated, priests were appointed, worship became law, but the spectacle did not stop there. According to ancient sources, Nero continued to speak to her corpse for hours, even days, as if she were still alive. Servants were ordered to refer to Poppaea in the present tense, and her seat at imperial banquets remained empty, but honored a chilling symbol of her ongoing presence in court life. Courtiers were trapped in this grotesque charade. Anyone who dared to suggest the emperor move on was punished, exiled, imprisoned, or worse. The imperial palace became a shrine to an idealized version of a woman who no longer existed. But even that wasn't enough. Nero's obsession with Poppaea had become untethered from reality. He no longer mourned a wife. He mourned an idea, a mirror of himself, beautiful, untouchable, and now unreachable. In his mind, she had not died, she had merely shifted forms. And into this psychotic gap between memory and denial, Sporus would step unknowingly drawn by fate or by resemblance into one of the most disturbing transformations in Roman imperial history. The grief had become ritual, the ritual performance, and soon the performance would demand a new actor. In the distorted theater Nero had constructed around Poppeia's death, Sporus entered as a silent understudy to a role no one should ever have to play. He was likely no older than 14 or 15, a young freedman born into slavery within the imperial household. Raised and educated within palace walls, Sporus may have envisioned a future in administration or court service, a path not uncommon for educated freedmen. Instead, he became the target of an emperor's delusion. Sporus's fate was sealed not by his choices, but by his appearance. Multiple ancient sources describe his uncanny resemblance to the late Poppaea, particularly in the eyes, the softness of his face, and the delicate structure of his features. In a society that often viewed physical likeness as a sign of divine or spiritual continuity, Nero likely saw this resemblance as more than coincidence. To him, it was a sign, a chance to undo what could not be undone. But there was one problem. Sporus was male. For most men, this would have ended the fantasy, but Nero was not most men, and certainly not most emperors. This was a man who had declared himself a god, who had built temples to his dead wife, who believed his voice could shake the heavens, and his love could cheat death. If Sporus's body did not match Nero's illusion, it would be reshaped by force. Nero did not merely command Sporus to dress like a woman. He ordered something far more horrifying: surgical castration performed by Rome's most skilled physicians, not for medical necessity, but to make the transformation permanent. It was a calculated act of physical and psychological domination. This was not transformation, it was erasure. The procedure itself would have been agonizing. With only crude anesthetics available in ancient Rome, Sporus was likely conscious during much of the operation. He was held down by guards while the surgeons worked. Infection, blood loss, and death were frequent outcomes. But Sporus survived. And in Nero's eyes, that survival marked not a victory of resilience, but a successful rebirth, the return of Poppaea remade in flesh that was not hers. Sporus's castration was not the end of his transformation. It was only the beginning. Once his body had been altered to satisfy Nero's fantasy, the emperor launched a comprehensive campaign to rebuild Sporus into a mirror of the woman he had lost. This process was not only physical, but deeply psychological, designed to erase Sporus's identity and replace it with an imitation of Poppaea Sabina. The imperial court became a staging ground for this metamorphosis. Sporus was given a new name, Sabina, in honor of the dead empress, and moved into specially appointed quarters. Imperial seamstresses designed an entire wardrobe of feminine garments, tailored to flatter his surgically modified body and disguise remaining masculine traits. Master jewelers fashioned custom pieces, some of which had once belonged to Poppaea herself. These were not adornments, they were symbols of submission, physical tokens that anchored Sporus to a role he never chose. Cosmetic artists trained him to apply makeup in the Roman aristocratic style kohl to widen the eyes rouge, to tint the cheeks powders, to soften masculine angles. His hair was curled, styled, and ornamented according to the latest trends among Roman noblewomen, often requiring hours of preparation each day. But it was the behavioral conditioning that left the deepest wounds. Sporus was assigned tutors in feminine movement, posture, and speech. He was taught how to sit, how to walk, how to tilt his head and fold his hands, how to carry himself, not as he was, but as Nero wished he would become. Voice coaches trained him to speak in higher registers to mimic the cadence and softness of Poppaea's remembered speech. Every gesture, every breath became a performance. Every day he was expected to look into polished bronze mirrors and see not himself, but a dead woman staring back. His name, his voice, his body, and his agency all had been rewritten. And at the end of this grotesque rehearsal came the final act, a royal wedding, planned not as a union of two souls, but as a ritual to enshrine the emperor's delusion. In the spring of 67 AD, Nero unveiled the culmination of his obsession, a full imperial wedding ceremony, joining himself not to a woman, but to the surgically altered teenage boy he now called Sabina. It was a spectacle as lavish as any the empire had seen. a pageant of delusion disguised as matrimony. The ceremony took place inside one of the largest halls of the imperial palace, adorned with imported flowers, draped silks, and illuminated by thousands of oil lamps. Musicians performed traditional Roman wedding songs. Platters of delicacies, roasted peacock, honeyed dates, imported wine were passed through the marble halls. For the unknowing observer, it might have appeared to be the wedding of a divine emperor and his radiant bride. But for those in the know, the truth was impossible to ignore. The bride was a teenage boy, mutilated and disguised, standing silently beside the most powerful man in the world. His face bore the makeup of a noblewoman. His gown had been crafted to mirror Poppaea's bridal attire. His jewelry had once adorned her body. Now it adorned the ghost of her memory. The ritual followed Roman tradition in eerie precision. Vows were exchanged, hands were joined, sacred bread was shared. Legal documents were signed to legitimize the union. Guests arrived with expensive gifts and rehearsed congratulations, their smiles tight with unease. Behind their well-trained eyes flickered horror, confusion, and helpless complicity. But no one dared refuse. In Nero's mind, the performance was complete. He had resurrected Poppaea. She walked beside him again. Sporus, or rather Sabina, was now treated not as a novelty, but as the Empress of Rome. He received his own palace apartments, household staff, a retinue, and a royal income. He sat beside Nero at public functions, was carried in a gilded litter, and was paraded before foreign dignitaries as the emperor's legitimate spouse. This was not love. It was pageantry bound to power. For Sporus, each day was not lived, but performed a permanent role in a play he had never auditioned for, scripted entirely by the man who killed the woman he was forced to become. After the wedding, Sporus's existence became a theater of unending performance. To the world, he was now the Empress of Rome, adorned in jewels, surrounded by servants, and granted every privilege the empire could offer. But beneath the silks and titles lay a hollowed identity, one that had been reshaped, repainted, and ultimately replaced. Nero did not treat Sporus as a novelty or symbol. He genuinely believed that Poppaea had returned. He spoke to Sporus using Poppaea's name, referenced shared memories from their past life together, and expected Sporus to respond in character as if those memories had truly belonged to him. Sporus was forced to participate in this elaborate fiction, mirroring not just a woman, but the emperor's memory of a woman. Every day was a test of survival. One misstep, one moment of confusion, hesitation, or silence could be interpreted as betrayal. Ancient sources describe how Sporus became unnervingly adept at this role, developing the ability to anticipate Nero's moods and responses with near-perfect accuracy. But his public performance came at a crushing cost. He became withdrawn, melancholic, the weight of his false identity pressing deeper into his psyche. His palace chambers were decorated to match Poppaea's former apartments. The mirrors reflected not his past, but a ghost. His voice no longer belonged to him. His mannerisms were rehearsed, his gestures practiced. There was no space left for who he had been before. When Nero traveled to Greece in 67 AD to participate in theatrical competitions, Sporus went with him not as a political figure, but as a living prop, a testament to Nero's ability to shape reality itself. Foreign dignitaries were expected to address him as Empress, to ignore the truth and accept the lie. But by 68 AD, Nero's grip on power was unraveling. Revolts broke out across the empire. The Senate declared him an enemy of the state. As Nero fled Rome with a small circle of loyalists, including Sporus, the empire he had built on illusion began to collapse. And yet, even as he prepared for death, Nero refused to let go of his living fantasy. When Nero's world finally crumbled, Sporus remained by his side not as a loyal consort, but as the last witness to a reign built on delusion and domination. As imperial forces closed in, Nero took refuge in a villa outside Rome, clinging to the hope of escape while preparing for a theatrical suicide. Even in those final moments, he could not part with Sporus, the living embodiment of the woman he had destroyed and then tried to resurrect. After Nero's death in 68 AD, Sporus was left exposed. He was no longer protected by imperial power, yet he remained an imperial symbol too recognizable to ignore, too controversial to safely keep. He became a political pawn, passed from one man to another, Nymphidius Sabinus, then Otho, and later Vitellius. Each treated him not as a person, but as a relic of Nero's madness, a tool to legitimize or mock the previous regime. With each transfer of ownership, Sporus's autonomy vanished further, his fate tied to the ambitions of powerful men. Finally, in 69 AD, still likely only around 20 years old, Sporus made the one choice that was truly his own. He ended his life likely by poison. His death was not just an escape from further exploitation. It was a final act of defiance, a rejection of the grotesque identity imposed upon him. In death, he reclaimed what little control he had left. And yet, even in historical records, Sporus is remembered less for who he was than for what he represented, a tragic symbol of imperial excess, a living doll molded by grief, obsession, and unchecked power. We will never know his dreams, his fears, or his voice. Only the silence he left behind speaks now, echoing across 2 millennia as a warning of what happens when power consumes humanity.